Welcome to the Ankler's Art and Crafts Podcast, a series where we talk to the talented artisans behind the biggest contenders in film and television. I'm Christopher Rosen, Ankler Media's deputy editor, and I'm so happy to bring you my recent chat with the Oscar-nominated production design team from Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, production designer Tamara Deverell, and set decorator Shane Vieau. This episode of Art and Crafts is sponsored by Netflix.
My maker told his tale, and I will tell you mine. I remember pieces, memories of different men. And I saw it. Your name. Victor Frankenstein. My creator. I demand a single grace from you. If you are not to award me love, then I will indulge in rage. Now, run.
First of all, congratulations, both of you, on this incredible film and these Oscar nominations. Obviously, I know you've both been nominated before. Shane, you won an Oscar before. I guess, does it ever, I don't imagine it ever gets old hat, but I mean, how did it feel to get the kind of recognition you did for this film specifically, I guess?
Specifically for this film, it was such a privilege to be part of that team because it really was such an amazing journey with Guillermo and Tamara to be able to take that script and bring it to life.
And Tamara, how about you?
Well, you know, when Guillermo leaned over to me it was actually at a premiere party for Nightmare Alley, and he leaned over and said, "Frankenstein." And I was like, wow, okay. And I was exhausted at the time. I was at this party in New York. I was exhausted because I was working on Cabinet of Curiosities, which Shane also did, and was a very difficult show with 7 or 8 different stories, different directors. Anyways, I was like, oh my God, Frankenstein, wow. And I kind of knew that he'd been waiting all his life to make this movie, literally since he was a little boy. So yeah.
I wanted to ask about that because obviously, I think I read since he was 7 years old, maybe, or 8 years old when he first saw Frankenstein, he wanted to do this. And I obviously, I know you guys have worked with him for so many years. Both of you obviously have collaborated with him so many times. Mm-hmm. I guess how do you where do you even begin in terms of taking his years of ideas about what this could be and kind of translating it into what it ends up being? I found that I find that really fascinating. How do you do it, and how do you kind of make it work the way it obviously does, I guess?
I don't know. Do you want me to go, Shane? I mean, I think you go to the University of Guillermo del Toro, you look at his movies, you study them. Obviously, we've both worked with him for many, many years, and so that really tells you all you need to know. I first worked with him when I was art directing on Mimic, so I already knew circles were a architectural theme that he liked to explore, arches, specific kind of arches, tiled environments, all those things were there from the get-go, and I obviously clicked with him. I liked his vision, so that it was easy to embrace all those things.
The nice thing about working with him a few times is that you develop a language with the director. And so basically any information that you're given, you already have a starting point. And so your job really is to take it, embellish it, and heighten it.
Do you have so with this obviously too, you have the not just the Guillermo of it all, but you have the source material and all these different things and also years of Frankenstein adaptations from the source material. I guess in terms of your research from that aspect, do you both go back? Are you going back to read the Mary Shelley? Where did you start? I guess very at the beginning of this project.
Absolutely reread Mary Shelley's book, which I hadn't read since I was 18, which she was the age she was when she wrote it, basically. Looked for things that I wanted to see in the novel, didn't find them. Like the whole creation scene actually doesn't exist. A creature is just sort of there. So that lore that we've seen time and time again in all these movies, it's just it's a turn of a page, and then there's the creature. So I looked respectfully at what she had done and how Guillermo was marrying that to his script, to his adaptation. And in many ways, I think he was very true to it. And in many ways, I think he brought in a lot of his own personal story and history and feelings as being a parent, a father, all of those, things that he had in his head for years, which I think is great. Guillermo encouraged us to look at some of the old Frankenstein movies, all of them, if we wanted, but then to just put them on the back shelf. We were making our own movie, I think, from the get-go.
What was also very, very inspiring was it was great early on that we were able to survey in Scotland and in London. And as you go to these amazing locations, which most of them are just so period relevant, it inspires you. And so it really comes together that way.
I want to ask about that too, in terms of there's obviously so much that you're doing on location, and then obviously so much that you're building. There's I think, what is there, 119 sets or something outrageous in this movie where it's so many. Yeah, how do you balance versus what you're finding on location versus what you're going to build, and how long does that process take for you, or are you already when you read the script you're already well, we'll probably obviously build this, or how do you kind of deal with that?
I'd say on the second reading of the script, that's when I'm starting. One of the first people to start with Guillermo. And at that point, he only had an outline. He was still writing the script. So he had 3/4 of script. He was writing it. I was sort of sussing out what should be built, what had to be built, the lab, the creature cell. These places don't exist. The ship, we actually toyed with the idea of finding a ship, which just doesn't exist, an Arctic exploration ship of the 1850s. No. So, you decide what you're building. And at the same time, we were looking at locations all over the world, literally from South Africa to Croatia to the Czech Republic. And given that part of it was actually set in Edinburgh, Scotland and the UK became a natural go-to. And that was my first time really spent with Guillermo in any big way, was actually traveling and looking at locations with him and with Guy Davis, our concept artist, and kind of honing the vision of the film, what it was going to become.
And after the locations were picked, the art department, Tamara and her team, did such a fantastic job marrying the sets that we built as tie-ins to the UK. It was such a pleasure to watch all those details come together. And for me, it just inspires me to really go for it.
The other thing I want to ask, obviously, this movie is an incredible achievement. All these departments working together, obviously all these Oscar nominations for these department heads. I was thinking how, in terms of building these sets and decorating these sets and in terms of how they're lit then for Dan in the cinematography, and I guess how much are you how, I'm sure obviously very much kind of connected in that collaborative process, but can you talk a little about that and making sure that what you're building is going to show will be able to be captured in the way that it should be, and how Dan wants and Guillermo wants and all those different things?
Really, when I'm designing a set, and Guillermo always makes the very good choice of bringing Dan, the cinematographer, on early. I'm doing it with him in mind. I have to think like a gaffer. That's what Guillermo we're all the same department. Production design is gaffing, is lighting. So, I'm very aware of how Dan's going to light it, and we have many conversations, and we do models, and we do lighting tests. We do the 3D models, foam core models. We taped things out in the studio. You know, Dan and Guillermo like to light from a single source lighting outside the windows. There's no lights really on set. That is not his style. So it's very natural and also very heightened painterly quality to the lighting. So, I really have to allow for that in the design. And Shane can talk about all the testing and.
For us, because of the period in the 1850s, electricity was just starting to sort of engage in. So for us, we didn't really use electrified lamps. We used mostly lanterns and candlelight. So it's always a huge conversation with the DP on how to achieve the best lighting that he needs in that set, and also on movement and window treatments, and, how to sort of soften his light or enhance his light. So it's an extremely engaged conversation that you work with him on every set to sort of make sure he has everything he needs to achieve the best lighting.
And then also, how about the movement too? Because obviously the camera, it's very fluid camera work, right? Too. And I guess it feels like the one of the things I love about this movie is it feels like there's just it feels so real. Like everything is so tactile. It feels so real that even if we're not seeing it, it feels like if the camera turned left, we'd have a whole big, elaborate setup that was probably actually there. And I guess how do you kind of think about how every piece of every piece of the set has the possibility, I guess, to be used in the shot. I don't know, every detail, keep making sure those details are so finely tuned.
Well, I think we know that Guillermo, of any director, and Dan as a DP, are going to see every inch of the set. So there isn't an area that we don't pay careful attention to. And the camera does swing around, and I'd say 80 or 90% of the shots are on a crane. So things have to move, like those big battery towers in the lab. Even the columns in the lab, they were all wild. They were all movable for the camera to swing through. And they have to move fast. We developed in the creature's cell, his sort of crypt, we developed a special system of lifting removing the columns by removing the bottom piece, and then we had a machine that actually lifted them that our welders built specifically. The Guillermo came, we have actual footage of him testing it to say, okay, can this happen in less than a minute? So yeah, but every all that, and it's a pain in the ass to have to make everything move, but you do it, and going and knowing you have to do it is half the battle. And then but the rich part of it, the rewarding part of it, is that you're going to have every piece of your work shown.
They're almost like a Where's Waldo situation. Those two guys will always come into a set and ask every single question about what moves. And if you make the mistake of saying something doesn't move, it's a deal. So those two guys in particular, you have to be hyper prepared to move and move fast, because they don't want to wait. For Guillermo, it's a waste of money, which is fully appreciated. So you definitely have to be prepared.
You mentioned the batteries. Obviously, there's so many different things we could talk about this movie that are just the weight of the set and the massive system. But the batteries in Dr. Frankenstein's lab, Victor's lab. I was rewatching some of the movie before, and just seeing Oscar Isaac interact with it, right? Turning all the dial, everything he's doing. It's just when you're watching, it doesn't even, you're not even thinking about this, right? But every little thing that he's kind of affixing on these batteries, you have to make work, right? And I guess can you talk a little about how maybe I don't know, how your work is impacting the performances a little bit, in terms of how the actors are just totally in this scenario, right? Where everything they're able to pick everything up or touch do everything that they're supposed to do. I don't know how, I just was watching and thinking of this, and I was like, wow, it's really fascinating that you had to build all these things from that, the batteries, especially in that scene when the creature's coming to life. I just was yeah, how do you think about how you're working with the actors? And then I guess, are you getting feedback from them at all after it's all built of how they're kind of handling some of this stuff?
You go, Shane.
What's interesting is that our film is called a fantasy film, but when Tamara and I with Guillermo approached the concept of everything that was in there, everything was of the period. Everything was of technology that was coming in the forefront at that time. So you kind of have to make it what you would say remotely believable. And that's what I love about Guillermo, because there'll be questions about, does this do this? Does that do that? And there's not a lot. I mean, there is a suspension of disbelief, but really back in the day, the technology was at the forefront, and, things like that were being experimented with.
Yeah, I mean, those battery towers, as an example, which are a great example, because it wasn't just that the actor had to make them work, which was the final dress of our amazing set deck department did all those pipes and gauges and valves that actually function, but the whole process of getting there, we had to build a framework that had to be wheeled. And then it had to look like antique glass that was green, but then could light red and appear to have smoke and steam and liquid inside. And those things took months to from concept to actual finished product. And we rebuilt them at one point because I wasn't happy with them. Shane wasn't happy with them. They were a massive undertaking.
And, also with watching all the Frankenstein movies, it is, how do they build the creature? How do they bring him to life? And for me, that was the biggest pressure of the film. How to make that sort of believable and something that is visual.
And
Yeah,
unique. Right. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, Shane already said this, but I think we like to embed ourselves in what is real and what is possible and viable and historic and historically accurate. And then, Guillermo kind of pushes the fantastical, and that's a great union, because somewhere in there we get something that the audience will not be distracted by, but be, maybe blown away by or enhance their experience, that is both fantastical and historical at the same time. And I think that's a lot of what we were trying to do in Frankenstein.
Do you have I guess I was thinking the way everything is wet, like I want to say weathered, or you know what I mean? Like everything in here looks like it's been so handled, right? And used, and it's not it's not from behind glass or something, and I guess how much time are you spending kind of making everything feel so lived in terms of the set deck, and also obviously the production design of it as well?
Well,
That's a great, go ahead, Tamara. Yep.
We both. Shane has a team of painters that are excellent, that are doing all the set dressing, all the linens, the fabrics, the draperies. Everything is so carefully aged, and it's all to give this painterly quality. I think the way I like to look at it is each frame of the film should look like a painting, with Dan's lighting, with Shane's set dressing, with Kate's costumes. It's all like this perfect, beautiful painting that we're trying to create.
And I've got to say that Sue Ellis, the head painter, there was so much time to make sure that every set was painstakingly layered, and, drips on the wall, stains everywhere, even into the draperies and stuff. I think it's the one great thing about working with Guillermo is that he loves aging. And so from the build to the set deck to the costumes, everything has an abhorrent amount of aging, to get that into the set. You look at it and it's got so much life to it. And that's the beauty of what we do, is to actually bring life to a single chair, which is such a simple chair. But if you actually look at it, the aging and history that's been added to that, it's art.
You mentioned Kate, obviously, too, another Oscar nominee for this film. But I guess in terms of the costumes too, how much and the colors in the movie, which are obviously very important. You mentioned red and the green and all these. I guess how much are you working together to make sure are you seeding those colors, or are you trying to enhance the whatever the costume color is going to be? Are we going to try to kind of even subconsciously put that somewhere in the set or the production design to make have that be an added experience for the audience, I guess?
Well, I would say very consciously, we're constantly sharing our illustrations with Kate. Our illustrations are pinned up in her wall with all her references and illustrations around them. So we're moving as a same vision, and we'll often dial things back or eliminate certain colors so that Kate's costumes are brought to the foreground. Not that we want to pop them, we want to blend them, but we don't want to, you want to focus on that, the beautiful blue dress that Elizabeth is wearing in this otherwise sepia tobacco toned room that is Harlander's house. Things like that are very consciously, deliberately done. The thread of the red, which you mentioned, which is the mother's tone throughout. We created a red bed. We created the red, fabric around the coffin for the mother, which related to Elizabeth's red bonnet, and that thread of red that, it's blended between costumes and production design and set deck seamlessly.
It's a very intimate, relationship, because there's so many conversations around color and really how to make sure the costumes, stand in and blend within the sets. And the nice thing is that Kate is really amazing at embracing that, that it is very, very much a team effort, even though we have individual stuff that we do to come together to make it like the wow process.
I wanted to go back to the beginning of the film. Obviously, I was watching again, like I said, I was rewatching stuff before this, and I was like, beginning of the film, you're in the farthest north, right? And we're opening in this Arctic area, and you have the massive ship. Obviously, Tamara, you mentioned like having to kind of build that, which I'd love to hear about. But just in terms of one of the things I was watching, I was like, well, where how'd you even do like the Arctic of it, like the snow and like all these things? Where I was like, they're not in the Arctic, obviously, and we don't even have snow like that anymore, really. So I was like, how do you even start there and like building that kind of set, and like even like kind of how'd you do that? I guess first before we get to the ship.
Well, welcome to Canada. That was the first thing we shot. We started in February. We sort of did it as a pre-shoot, and we went up north. Not all the way to the Arctic, but to a lake, which, because it has no tree line really, are a very few, they had a little bit of stuff that VFX artfully removed. But we shot that on Lake Nipissing, north of Toronto. And, it was actually an unseasonably warm year, and the lake was melting. So we constantly had these ice checkers making sure that the ice was thick enough, because we had huge equipment and trucks and things on that ice. So that's where we shot all that like big Arctic stuff. And then the stuff around the ship we actually built, to a big extent, a big giant ice field that then again was extended by VFX on the wide shots. But yeah, beautifully done by VFX.
It's really great. And then obviously the ship, which we're like you mentioned, like so. Like building that, I like, again, it's such a massive set. I can't even how much time did it take just to build that set and like kind of like make it sure it looked appropriate, like some way what it should?
I think it took 4 or 5 months to build from the get-go, and that had to be engineered around a giant gimbal that, if you walked onto the starboard side of the ship, you would see it was all open. That side of the ship wasn't finished. So the port side that we did all our filming against was all complete. But our special effects team did a giant gimbal. So when the creature rocks the boat, it actually rocks. The ship was about 130 feet long, and it was just a massive, massive thing. It just was a lot of labor of old boards and woods and wood that was painted many, many times, because that's what ships are like, and metal plates that we added because that's what Arctic ships had to cut through the ice, which I love that sort of motif because it's very Frankenstein-y. And then and then the icing on the cake was Shane and the set deck crew, and you can talk about Jim Dine. We had this fellow come from the UK. Shane, you want to talk about Jim? And
yeah, there's a gentleman named Jim Dines in the UK who is probably the most world-renowned expert on period boats. And he does most of the rigging in film around the world of these period boats. And, he came in and built all the ropes and the lashings and the pulleys and just did such a beautiful job. Like, he just knew it straight out and made the sails and everything. He really was a savior for us. We had a team that worked with him, but he ended up actually training all the extras and being part of the shoot during the shoot days. He was fantastic.
He did like a boot camp. Once the ADs found out he was an actual sailor, they had him do a boot camp with all the extras so they looked like they knew what they were doing with the winding of the ropes and the, going to the mainstays and looking at the binnacle and all that stuff. It's a big learning curve.
And then how about inside the ship? You have obviously the captain's quarters where we have where Frank Victor is telling his story and like the framing of the movie. Like, can you talk a little about that set and like kind of, the detail that went into that room and like kind of thinking about that, I guess.
It was interesting. You see the big circle window theme that Guillermo loves, that, Victor is centered on that window in the back. That was an interior set. We built it in the studio right next to the ship. So if the weather was inclement or, not in our favor, they could go inside and shoot in the captain's quarters. What I loved about that is, we started off with it as a wooden thing, like just natural oak walls. And then I think Guillermo went home one weekend and watched a few movies like Mutiny on the Bounty and saw that they're often painted white, which I had sort of mentioned, but I didn't want to push it. And he came back to me after the weekend. We hadn't started building it. He said, let's try it white. So we tried it white in our 3D model and illustrated it. And then that was a go. And I think it really made it beautiful because then we could really feel the coldness of it, and it wasn't this dark hole. It became it had more life to it. And then we just had 2 other colors, black and gold and blue, 3 other colors besides white. And that was our palette for that entire space. And we kept the ceilings really low, which again, I love Guillermo and Dan for that. They don't care if the actor, like Jacob Elordi, who plays the creature, has to duck. Embrace that he had to duck under the lower parts of the beams, which makes it very real and very then actors start acting with their bodies. There was a lot of that Guillermo does where he really, I want to say torches, but it makes it hard for the actors sometimes to move through their spaces. But they're so good at it. And then Shane's furniture. That stuff in there was,
it's simple furniture, but the gimbaled lighting and stuff in there just really worked and just enhancing off those colors. And, it really was beautiful with the low ceiling because on camera, it's beautiful framing.
Mm-hmm. And even if it was a high ceiling, Jacob Elordi is very tall. So even if it was high ceiling, I think he's still probably really talk, but yes.
Hey, listen, I did a movie right before this one with Jacob, and it was Priscilla, and he was playing Elvis Presley, and we had to build Graceland for the Sofia Coppola movie, and I actually extended the height of the ceilings in that, knowing it was him, and extended the height. We custom built a sofa, made it higher because he has such long legs. And then now on Frankenstein, we're completely ignoring that, and it's just like, poor guy, he had to crouch in that cell that we built. But to me, that's part of it. That's part of the charm of it.
I was thinking too of the cottage that he goes to, right? Obviously with that too is another. If he's just so it's just because he is so big, but obviously Frankenstein is so big, so kind of fitting in these places is it's interesting, and I think it really obviously it's a great performance. He's an Oscar nominee as well. So do you? Before we wrap up here, we're talking about Guillermo obviously, and like I said, I know you've both worked with him many years, and so successfully in this. He feels as a fan, he feels so unique to me as a filmmaker because he's so, and obviously there are other filmmakers who are valuing, kind of tactile and realist, making things as real as possible, even in a fantasy, kind of story or fairy tale story like this. But to me, he does feel very unique. And I guess, do you how is getting to work with him at such a close level, on all these projects and especially Frankenstein, how do you how do you view him now, even after this project? I don't know. Does he continue to rise in your estimation, or through these projects, or are you just oh, it's Guillermo's great and we already know he's great, that kind of thing?
He always surprises me. Even after we finished doing this movie, and as we've been doing a lot of these Q&As and stuff, I'm finding out things about his process that I didn't know, that maybe I didn't need to know, but that it's such a personal thing for him as a father and as a son. The whole father-son relationship and story that he's telling. I found out, things about his past that I didn't really know. So he always surprises me. There's certain things I think that we know that is just like, okay, Guillermo's going to want this. And then there's certain things that that are always a surprise. And I'm interested to see what he's going to do next, because Frankenstein's a tough act to follow. And I know he's had postpartum depression probably since he'd made the movie. He's maybe moving off it now, but it's a tough act to follow.
Very simply for me, he values you and he sees you. And that's extremely important to have when you're working for a director, because, a lot of times it doesn't happen. And so for him to see you and value you, it just makes you work much harder for him. Such a great man.
And then I guess also just talking about this, obviously Frankenstein is, like we said, like a classic story that like now we've gotten here from Guillermo, and your work on this, I think for the next generation, we'll be looking at this as like the quintessential Frankenstein story. I guess, you're not necessarily that you had a relationship to the material, but I think everybody has some connection to Frankenstein, I guess, a little bit because it's such a classic. Did you get like did you come up with did you find new things about this story that maybe you didn't even think about before embarking on this project?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I found that personally, the character of Elizabeth, who I think Guillermo's going to do another cut of the movie and include scenes that he had taken out of her. I found her just fascinating, and she was sort of the voice of humanity and womanhood and Mary Shelley in a way for me. So like that was just like, oh, wow, okay. Not a huge part, but a very significant role. So that was interesting. And also the creature's embodiment of the female and the male, like there's a certain kind of, it's otherworldliness about that goes beyond our natural tendency to break our world into male and female. To me, he had this very otherworldly quality, that I think a lot of young people understand more than we do, but it's a new world,
To me, it's the value of human nature, just the concept of wanting to be loved. It's a very, very simple concept, but at the end of the day, we're missing it today. And I think what I valued about doing this film really was bringing that back.
Yeah, it's a really great movie, and it's really moving. I mean, I've watched it like I said a couple times, and it's a really moving movie. I think and it really you feel like such an emotional connection to the creature, and it's great work. And your work on this is incredible as well, Tamara and Shane. Thank you so much for doing this, and again, congratulations on those Oscar nominations.
Thank you, Christopher.
I appreciate you having us today. Thank you.